The subject of my talk is what people who spend their professional lives studying international security think the United States should do in the world writ large. And fundamentally, if you read the literature written by people like me who are in my world, but also you've got plenty of them here at Notre Dame, if you read the literature they write, they spend their lives like studying international relations, and they debate what should America's role in the world be. The fundamental question at the root of their debate is what would happen if the United States pulled back from the world? What would happen if the United States decided, you know what, let's just not have these ramified security alliances, and let's not aspire to a leadership role in global international institutions, the global economy, the global security architecture. Let's come home and tend our own garden. What would happen? There's a group of scholars who think that would be great. There's a group of scholars who think that would be disastrous. And the question that I am addressing with my co-authors, Steve Brooks and Caleb Pomeroy, in the paper I circulated in advance of this talk, is asking the question, like, why do they disagree in their answer to this question? Why do they disagree? Whence comes this different vision of what a world without an engaged America would look like? And the answer has to be, it has to lie, at least partly, in theory, because the future hasn't happened yet. And the only way we can forecast what would happen is to have some theory about how the world works without the United States. Until the United States actually pulls back from the world and we get to observe the results, theory informs our expectations about what would happen. Now, when I used to say that line, until America pulls back from the world, we'll never see what this is like, people used to roll their eyes and go to sleep because the idea of the Americans actually pulling back from the world seemed pretty fantastical only a few years ago. But now it seems slightly less fantastical, at least concerning one important region, Europe, the region around which American grand strategy has revolved for the last 100 years. There's a possibility that we could see a series of events that ended in a substantially reduced, if not ultimately eliminated, role of the United States in the security of that continent. So the question, which was once academic, is practical. But whether you are a practical, hard-bitten policymaker or you're an airy-fairy academic up in the ivory tower, your answer to the question of what happens after an American withdrawal is driven by the theories that you think are most plausible about how the world works. So what our paper does is it interrogates those theories. It tries to unpack those theories behind these two starkly opposed positions. Are these the only positions that people take about foreign grand strategy? No, there are others. But we argue that these are the most probative, these are the most instructive, namely the idea of a grand strategy that goes under the name of restraint, namely working towards ultimately a United States whose security is disconnected from the security of the rest of the world, and a grand strategy of deep engagement, which argues for sustaining the core American commitments to especially Europe and East Asia that have defined world politics for the last 70 years. So we're going to compare and contrast those two positions and ask why do they differ about what would happen to the world if the United States pulled back. All right, any questions about what I'm doing? You on board? Yeah.
Why not consider like other parts of the world as well, like just?
Yeah, because the grand strategists focus on the regions they think are most important to America's security and prosperity, and they still think those are Europe, Asia, and to a lesser degree Middle East, and those are the areas where the United States has existing security commitments. That is to say, it has alliances under which it pledges to come to the defense of allies if they're attacked. So those two regions loom large in this debate. All right, so we select these two grand strategies and we ask ourselves, like, why do the scholars who recommend these grand strategies come up with different estimates of a post-American world? And we read assiduously the literature. If you looked at our paper, you'll see gigantic footnotes. Those are actually reporting things that we actually read, actually really carefully and sometimes multiple times. And we see that behind these contrasting visions of a post-American world are not grand theories like you might have studied in IR 101. It's not a difference over whether we think realism is right or liberalism is right or constructivism is right. Instead, what we find really driving these differences are middle-range theories in a couple of key areas, in particularly 4 kinds of middle-range theory. First, if you're going to try to understand what Europe and Asia would be like without the American pacifier, you need some theory of balancing of power. How do countries balance power? How do security dynamics work in these regions? So we can model what happens when the US leaves. Nuclear weapons are probably the most important thing that have happened in the realm of security in the last, since their invention. And they are a profound influence on international politics. You need a theory of what the nuclear revolution in international politics means in practice and what the implications of further proliferation of nuclear weapons would look like. You need an understanding of interstate cooperation. After all, for the last 80 years, the United States has worked hard to try to leverage its security commitments into leadership of various and sundry international institutions, from the UN to the NATO to the WTO to an alphabet soup of international organizations. So what happens to international cooperation if the US isn't trying to lead institutions that foster that cooperation? And fourth, both of these grand strategies, deep engagement and restraint, posit that America benefits from international economic exchange. So participation in the global economy matters. So just a quick note, people who support restraint grand strategy don't support neo-mercantilism. They don't support tariff wars. They don't support massively ramping up American tariffs. They like trade, and so do people who support deep engagement. But what they differ on is the question of whether American security commitments and American leadership matter for the economic gains the United States reaps from its interactions with the world. So those are the 4 key middle-range theories that we think explain why reasonable people, smart people who spend their lives studying international security so starkly disagree on the possible consequences of an American withdrawal from the world. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit more about these, and each for deep engagement and for the restraint idea. And then we've lost our entire, oh, there it is. Oh.
They're still there.
Oh, they're there. We just don't see them. Okay. Thought maybe the Russians were coming after me again. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about how these different strategies play out. Then I'm going to talk about an implication of that's quite interesting, and then conclude. So, very quickly, let's look at these middle-range theories and how they explain these differences. So, people who believe that the United States is best served by continued engagement forecast a nasty consequence of U.S. withdrawal. They believe it's necessary for the United States to maintain robust global leadership in economic and security affairs. And they think that this leadership of the United States helps prevent a hostile power from dominating any key region. So it's American involvement helps create a balance of power to constrain potential hegemonic threats to the United States. They think American engagement deters dangerous security rivalries and conflict between countries in these regions, even if there is no hegemonic threat. They think that these security alliances give the United States levers of influence that help the U.S. promote and shape a liberal, open economic order to expand the global economy and advance its own economic interests. And they think this engagement enables a global leadership role in international institutions. So what they predict, if this is withdrawn, if this American role is pulled back, is they predict balancing failures in key regions like Europe and Asia. So the aspiring revisionist powers of Russia and China will have a potential possibility of dominating those regions because the local states without American leadership will fail to balance. They think there will be strong pressure for nuclear proliferation. So, for example, We now see Europe starting to ponder its security options. Will Europe be able to deter Russia? Down the road, we could imagine a nuclear Poland. We could imagine perhaps a nuclear Germany. We could imagine nuclear Ukraine if it could get its hand back on nuclear weapons. All of that a possibility. All of that in the view of deep engagement, dangerous. All of that leading to potential leakage, to potential nuclear use, or at least raising the likelihood of it. They predict breakdown in cooperation as U.S. leadership is withdrawn, economic turmoil from potential security competition and wars. So from where does that grim vision emerge? It comes from a version of these middle-range theories. Deep engagers think balancing failure is typical. They have a theory of inefficient balancing, a pessimistic view that states routinely over or under balance. They either buy too many weapons and the wrong kinds of weapons and threaten neighbors, or they don't buy enough and they allow hegemons the possibility to expand. They are nuclear pessimists. They worry that states will not be fully responsible and careful in their use of nuclear weapons, in their maintaining of stocks, in their preservation of security of those nuclear stocks. They believe that cooperation in international institutions is more likely when there is a clear leader helping to foster such cooperation. That's a version of international institutionalist theory and hegemonic stability theory. And they have a theory of the global economy that it's so highly interdependent that if economic turmoil emerges in one of these key regions, even if the U.S. is not involved, it will have terrible effects on the U.S. economy. So those are the core middle-range theory: inefficient balancing, nuclear pessimism, hegemonic stability and institutionalist theory, and finally economic interdependence theory that all underline this grim vision of a world without America. So that's the deep engagement side. What about the restrainers? Their foreign policy, as I said, is about essentially ensuring America from what the restraint people think is the main threat, which is that the U.S. gets dragged into a war that it's not absolutely necessary to fight. The fearsome cost of that war, the burdens that it places upon the United States are so huge that in some sense is the main danger of all of these security alliances. Secondarily, they just don't like the massive military expenditures that seem to be necessary to sustain credible alliances in these areas. Their idea is the United States would essentially be fine if it could disentangle itself from its various and sundry security commitments. They figure if the United States does this carefully, not a crazy, haphazard, chaotic withdrawal from the world, but a phased plan, a grand strategy of easing back America from its manifold commitments. They believe that if the United States does that ultimately the world will probably be fine, but America will definitely be fine. In other words, there could be some turmoil, there could be some increased security competition, who knows, a war might erupt, but if all that does happen, it's not going to affect the United States. Or at least the effects of the United States will be far less costly than the cost of trying to maintain engagement. And why do they think that? Why do they view the counterfactual world of a disengaged America so positively? It simply is a different version of all of these middle-range theories that I just went through for deep engagement. They tend to think balancing is efficient, that states normally faced with the critical life and death decisions of securing themselves will balance. They will create balances of power to constrain hegemons. They may make a mistake now and then, but if they do, the ramifications would not be substantial enough to cross oceans and harm American security. Restrainers also tend to be nuclear optimists, namely that on the critical life and death decisions of nuclear weapons, states can be relied upon to keep control, to not inadvertently allow escalation, to not irresponsibly allow nuclear leakage. It's a serious business, nuclear weapons, restrainers say. It focuses the mind. It focuses governments. The result is you can be pretty confident that nuclear weapons proliferation in the future will be a lot like nuclear weapons proliferation in the past. Namely, we always are terrified of it before it happens, then it happens and it turns out fine. That is an optimistic view of the nuclear revolution, which means that states can acquire nuclear weapons to secure themselves relatively cheaply. Once you've got nuclear weapons, you can be pretty safe from attack. And essentially what that means, if you take those two theories of efficient balancing and nuclear optimism, you basically don't have to worry about this problem of regional hegemony. Russia is not going to attack and conquer countries that are nuclear armed. They probably won't attack countries even in their region because those countries will probably balance anyway. But if they don't, they can resort to nuclear weapons, which will definitely prevent any kind of dangerous regional hegemony. Asia, China, a fearsome economy and rapidly growing, looks like a superpower. A nuclear Japan and a nuclear South Korea have nothing to fear from even a very powerful China. So if you're a nuclear optimist and you are an efficient balancing theorist, you're not worried about the problem that has driven American grand strategy throughout the 20th and 21st century, this idea of being scared that some regional hegemon will emerge and come over and threaten American security and prosperity. So that takes care of like the clear security element of why restrainers think that the regions of Europe and Asia will be fine without the American pacifier on the security front. It's also, the restrainers overall just seem less concerned that American leadership is necessary for international cooperation. They have a theory that cooperation probably isn't all that important in international relations, but if it is, it will emerge from self-interest rational states. If states need to cooperate on global warming, if they need to cooperate to keep the global economy working, if they need to cooperate against terrorist threats, if they need to cooperate against terrorist financing, if they need to cooperate against environmental protection, all these things, you don't need an in-your-face American leadership to get that. You can get that through states cooperating as they need. So it's kind of it's a theory that cooperation emerges as needed by rationally led states when needed, and basically probably isn't super important to America's core national security interests anyway. The theory of how concerned America needs to be about the global economy that animates the restraint vision of a post-American world is one in which the global economy is pretty resilient. Economies respond to shocks. It may take some adjustment, but they respond to shocks. They don't need global hegemons like the United States providing security. If American withdrawal were to lead to some insecurity in a region, an arms race, or maybe even a local regional war because the American pacifier were no longer there, that would create economic costs in that region, but they would not necessarily impact the United States all that much. So in other words, the interdependence is real. Economic globalization happened, but that global economy, from the U.S. can reap its benefits, the benefits that it gets from that global economy without providing complex security guarantees to regions and without assuming leadership of the institutionalized cooperation on the global economy. So those are roughly speaking, how these middle range theories break between the two camps. And so by doing this, in the exercise in the paper, what at least we get is we get a kind of scorecard of theories or underlying these two diametrically opposed positions, which any consumer of these articles or recommendations can read and ask themselves, okay, sort of like, am I persuaded by these theories or not? Or which theories seem to have the most support? Which seem plausible? So at least at that very basic level, the exercise we undertake in the articles is kind of useful for the debate. But beyond that, we noticed as we undertook this that there's a almost deeper difference between the two camps. And that has to do, and I'm going to talk about for a second, that has to do with the assumptions about decision making, assumptions about human psychology. That if you look at how they break down these middle range theories in each case you'll notice that the deep engagement scholars are dubious about states' abilities or leaders' abilities to carefully, rationally calculate and to respond, if not optimally, at least smartly, to their strategic incentives. Whereas if you look at the restraint camp, there's a greater confidence that on matters that are important to grand strategy, states will, in some sense, ultimately do the right thing. They will act more or less rationally. In other words, deep engagers are more skeptical about strict rational choice assumptions. They have a more bounded, more limited view of state or leader rationality. And restrainers are somewhat more confident that, again, not on everything, but on these things, states can be relied upon to be careful, rational, procedurally rational deciders. And so if you look at that, you can see that in each theory. So balancing theory, again, efficient balancing theory, it actually places pretty high demands on leaders. They have to assess threats. They have to cooperate when it's hard to cooperate, where it may not be in their short-term interests. They have to balance between domestic and international requirements. They have to build just the right amount of weapons so they don't inadvertently threaten neighbors and generate security dilemmas. They just kind of get that Goldilocks just right posture. All that has to go for them. If it doesn't, things start to go awry. The more it goes awry, the more states depart from that high rational ideal of statecraft, the greater the threat of balancing failure. And so deep engagers think that having a collective action problem solver, having an overseas Uncle Sam helping out the balancing, eases those departures from ideal balancing. And it goes through very clearly in the nuclear realm. Proliferation is pretty awesome as a tool for providing security if you can rely on states to be rational, if you are confident that they will build postures that make sense, if you're confident that escalation won't occur inadvertently, if you're confident that human emotions won't take over in a crisis. If you are confident of those things, if you think leaders will act sensibly under those intense circumstances, you'll be more inclined to have a sanguine view towards spreading nuclear weapons to make states more secure and to reduce the demand for American security. And the same goes on cooperation. So cooperation emerges as needed, but it's harder if you don't have it institutionalized. Institutions help to deal with boundedly rational, short-term thinking agents. Institutions help them iterate that cooperation, help them avoid some of the short-term thinking and some of the departures from cooperation. They help ensure a kind of long-term rationality of achieving the long-term aims, even if in the immediate circumstance it may not seem to be in your rational best interest. So again, it seems as if the deep engagers kind of side more on a bet that, yeah, people tend to be, at best, boundedly rational, whereas state behavior is expected under restraint to be a little bit more closer to what we model as rational choice. And finally, the global economy and its susceptibility to animal spirits or not. How rational should we expect the global economy to respond if there is a war in some region? Should financial markets take it calmly or do they freak out? Do business decisions occur on extraordinarily careful costs and benefits, or are there panics? Again, it seems as if deep engagement thinks that people are kind of wacky and they need a sort of leader to help them not do crazy things. Just like in domestic politics, deep engagement thinks, well, in international politics, you kind of need this as well. So across all of the middle range theories, we see this different bet on different visions of the psychological foundations of decision making. What bet do you want to make? The more confident you are in the basic long-term rationality of state behavior, the more confidence you can have in that the middle range theories that restraint invokes will likely pan out okay for the world and for the US if the US withdraws. The more skeptical you are of that proposition, the more you're likely to think the status quo engagement policy makes sense. Okay, so we are almost out of time. Covered some territory. I'm going to wrap this up, but I just want to think about, and there's lots of things we can talk about, but you could apply these arguments and think about, like, well, what do you think would happen in Europe if the United States is no longer securing Europe? And if you're pessimistic about it, if you're pessimistic about that vision, if you think the current trajectory that US and Europe are on may ultimately someday lead in a Europe that has to secure itself without the United States, do any of these theories that I've mentioned, the differences, make sense in terms of how you would project that Europe without America in the future? Can Europeans be relied upon to rationally balance the challenge from Russia? Can Russia be relied upon to act rationally with respect to its security needs in Europe? These are tools. They don't answer the questions. We really honestly try to write this paper in a way that, even though Brooks and I are on record saying we think deep engagement is the best bet, we really tried to write the paper in a way that wasn't like trying to make an argument for deep engagement. And indeed, in the conclusion, we mentioned that the arguments the findings or the discussion that we unfold in the paper has implications for both advocates or those scholars who recommend both grand strategies. For restraint, it is the way that we think they model decision-making by states does run up against a ton of scholarship that's just skeptical about states' ability to act this way and leaders' ability to act this rationally. We think the cognitive demands are really, really high on pursuing that kind of statecraft, and lots of behavioral, the behavioral revolution in social science in some sense is skeptical, but definitely that book is not closed. We have a lot of history of states avoiding the kinds of catastrophic decisions that people long worried about when it comes to things like balancing and nuclear proliferation. So the jury remains out, but that's something to think about. And for deep engagement, the obvious question is, well, if you think people are such poor deciders, why do you trust the United States to be rational with all of the power this grand strategy gives it? After all, when you think about what's deep engagement is about, it's about power in the classic sense of that term. It's about gaining influence in the world. And the whole argument about deep engagement is that this influence that the United States purchases through the security guarantees it maintains around the world, that this influence, this power it gets, that it's good, that's a good thing, that it helps the United States. But it can also be a bad thing, because if people are irrational or people can't be relied upon to act rationally, you're worried about any country being that powerful. And you're worried about any country being relatively unconstrained. What do deep engagers have to answer that question of what faith should we have in the rationality of this country upon which you urge this grand strategy of global engagement? And so with that, I think I'll wrap up my comments and look forward to the fun part, which is the Q&A.
Thanks for your time. I have two questions, if that's all right. I have a question first about the offense-defense balance. It was interesting to me that you only mention offense-defense balance once in the read ahead. I think it's also footnoted once. So I went back and reread Come Home America, and it's the first theoretical concept that comes up in that paper as the foundation for restraint. The idea generally being that if the trend of tech especially is pretty defensive, and especially allies and partners in East Asia, for example, are in pretty good geographic positions. It seems like even if countries don't balance that efficiently, as long as the offense-defense balance is predominantly defensive, it would be actually pretty easy for them to defend against China. So I'm interested in why your description of restraint doesn't include more of that. I also have a question about theory. So it seems to me like the kind of main idea behind Mearsheimer and Rosado's book is that if we don't have some kind of common conception of rationality, it's pretty difficult to rely on theories to explain the past and also to try to help guide us in the present and future. I'm interested in why that you think that even with the idea that humans or some kind of actors like states might not act in a very rational way, that theories can still help us guide our way through the world.
So those are great. On the first question about offense and defense theory, we mention it and fold it into one of the reasons why they are optimistic about balancing, because they think balancing is pretty easy, or relatively easy, because defense tends to dominate over offense. So we don't make it, but so that's definitely we could raise that. Its problem is we could raise the salience of that theory. So I completely take that point. We sort of bury it into an overall sanguine view of balancing. The challenge of balancing is much less if defense tends to dominate. On the second question about rationality and international relations, I mean, we basically just use the definition of rationality. So we use the definition. We think of rationality the way that Mearsheimer and Rosado are arguing against. So they think the concept of rationality that we're using in this paper is not a good one. But it's the one that I think you kind of need to believe the most sanguine version of what happens when the United States withdraws. In other words, I think that for balancing to be efficient, for proliferation to work the way restrainers think, I think you need a pretty high definition. I think you need a definition of rationality that's a little bit more demanding than the one in their book, because the one that they have is a relatively low bar. All you need is a plausible theory and a deliberative process. So I think for this paper, it's kind of like the standard. I hate to say. I mean, the standard view of what rational behavior implies is what works for this analysis. Does that make sense? Yeah.
We do want to have more students. Thank you, Bill, for coming. Thank you for an interesting and good paper, as always. You finally got to it at the end. Like, your presentation was, in a sense, admirable that you talked about they deep engagers and they restrainers. But deep engagers means you and Steve and some hangers-on who aren't as good at it as you, because you're exceptional at it. And you have come into the nest of vipers. Like, you have bravely sallied into the home turf of restraint, because Joe, Mike, me, we're here. And good for you. And as always, I think your characterization, I have some quibbles, but your characterization of the mid-range theories that make up restraint and the mid-range theories that make up deep engagement is basically right. So let's just leave that aside for the moment. Your new thing in this article is the claim about rationality. And the problem is that it's interesting to think about the rationality assumptions, but you've got them exactly backwards, right? In that deep engagement requires a much higher standard of rationality, hyper-rationality, and restraint is built on the idea of inability to get enough information and process enough information to plan and run the world. And it's on all four of the mid-range theories you talk about, right? So I thought the clearest one was going to be on the economy, where restrainers are Hayek people, not Keynes people. And you talk about animal spirits, and you talk about the need for a planner to overcome the irrational animal spirits. Keynes is making the assumption that the rational planner can get information and in a counter-cyclical way manage the business cycle and do the right economic policy. It requires a huge amount of economic information and decision-making. And Hayek argued that that was dangerous and a bad idea, and that the fundamental thing was you couldn't get enough information, and even if you had the information, you couldn't make a plan, that what you needed was decentralized activity of lots of people trying to take care of themselves, because you can understand your own situation and the details in the local environment much better than the global economy or the global environment. And so because of bounded rationality, because of the inability to manage the whole system, everyone should just take care of themselves, which is the fundamental claim that restraint makes, right? We're Hayek people. You are Keynes people, who were the planners, who are the folks that need the clear idea of how to fix all the problems for everybody. But it strikes me like the nuclear revolution might be even more clear. So like the original argument going back to Schelling, but certainly taken up by Jervis, is that, you know, it's complicated to figure out the balance of power and details on, you know, where security is. But nuclear weapons are so destructive compared to everything else that you can even be a risk-acceptant decision maker and still be deterred by the risk of nuclear escalation. That it doesn't take fine-grained calculation and optimal rational thinking to understand, keep me the hell away from nuclear escalation and nuclear war. The people who require high levels of rationality and very sophisticated command and control are the people who advocate complicated offensive counterforce nuclear doctrines to support extended deterrence and the alliance network. That's what Herman Kahn and now people like Darryl Press and Keir Lieber are up to creating, right? They make hyper-rationalist assumptions about how to use nuclear weapons for the alliance network and for the global presence, whereas people who believe in the nuclear revolution and restraint think, actually, it doesn't take sophisticated thinking, it doesn't take brilliance, it doesn't take a ton of information. Simple heuristics are good enough for nuclear deterrence. I'm going on too long, but the same sort of argument is true about balancing people who believe in restraint. There are clearly recognize the problems of external balancing and tendencies to buck pass in alliance relationships. Like, geez, Barry Posen wrote a book about restraint, and this was the core argument of his career-making book, you know, Sources of Military Doctrine. Like, we know about this, but we also think people can take care of themselves through internal balancing, and it doesn't take as complicated a set of perfect judgments about international security to achieve adequate balancing in the world we live in today, given the distribution of power and given the offense-defense balance, as Marco points out, right? So, I mean, basically, I think you're barking up an interesting tree, but you've just got it all backwards. You don't need, like you guys are the guys who need a really clear-eyed, sophisticated view in order for the United States to plan the world. And our sensitivity to the inability to do that is precisely what drove us to invent the restraint grand strategy 25 years ago.
Yeah, I think I think if you really read what you just said, it's really not what you said. It's that the problems are easy to solve, so that you're really putting the burden of your response on, especially on the balancing the nuclear, that the problems are just by their nature do not require a particularly heroic assumptions to solve. And so that's a different difference. I would say that's a different distinction between us than the ones you were actually talking about. But as to take you on your own ground, I would say that of the three things you just said, the econ one was the strongest, but that's kind of not what we said, and the other two are weaker. So let's start with the other two. With the nuclear revolution thing, the fundamental question at issue is, does proliferation solve the regional problem? Why do we think the regions will be relatively fine if we leave? Well, one reason is because nuclear proliferation is available. So the question at issue is the one debated between I'll make this simple so we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. The question we are addressing is the one debated between Sagan and Waltz. Okay, you can go read Sagan and Waltz and ask which one of those guys is assuming rational and which one of those people is assuming non-rational. And the answer is Waltz, the guy who thinks proliferation is a great solution, is explicitly at length over and over again insisting that you can count on states to be rational in this area. Whereas Sagan, the one who went on and on and on writing that proliferation is dangerous, says on the contrary, you have to accept the possibility that state behavior will depart from this assumption. And on the question of balancing, again, it's how likely is it that balancing will go awry? How likely is it that states will purchase the kinds of weapons that will generate spirals that are unwanted and that lead to intense costs? Again, the cognitive demands and the demands on decision-making of the state to avoid those kinds of spirals are, by the work of Jervis and many others, just very, very high and very, very difficult to do. So confidence that states will reliably do this and do it in a manner that doesn't have all kinds of externalities just seems to me to line up more in the rational choice camp than ours. Now, on the econ one, the claim, no deep engager claims the United States is organizing the world economy like a Keynesian planner. It's simply that does insecurity lead to the kinds of market reactions that may not quickly readjust? And what are the reasons for the what are the reasons for the slowness of the market to readjust? In other words, how bad is it for the United States if turbulence in some global region creates large economic panics or large financial crises that are not quickly responded. So on that one, it's like I've always thought of the Hayek kind of restraint position as a kind of efficient market position. That the local person knows what they're doing and they will respond rationally, and there's no need to worry that there will be overreactions or suboptimal reactions to disturbances of various sorts in various kinds of markets. Isn't that right?
It is.
Uh-huh.
The claim is that you can't do better than that. Right. They might make mistakes, but there's not an alternative that does better.
Well, one way you do better than that is preventing the war, which is what deep engagement does.
Thank you for the talk, for the paper. I'm going to double back down a little bit on what Eugene said, just a little bit differently, though. So, you take a psych approach in the paper, which I get it, but I'm sort of having trouble on why you go to the lowest level possible. So you can imagine a different way of doing it, of taking, for something that I would do is take a feminist approach, where you cast it at a higher level that's going to pay more attention to the gender discourses around all of this, right? So when I hear the word restraint, I think BDSM. When I hear deep engagement, well, the sexual undertones just speak for themselves here, right? But more fundamentally, are other states rational? Can we count on them being rational or not? And I sort of think about that more in Eugene's point on hyper-rationality, where it really does become down to a question of, does the world need Uncle Sam versus will the world be fine without us? And implicit, at least, in the rationality, the way you talk about it, is that those people might have a rationality problem, but the United States is going to be just fine. That we can act the way we're going to act, and it's going to be better for the world than if we just leave them for themselves. So I know you touched on this at the end of your talk, but you didn't go too deep into it. But it does strike me as it does require this idea of the world is better with us in it because we're just going to be better at decision making. And so when you're talking about nuclear proliferation, you're saying, there's a higher risk of accidents if other countries get the bomb. But you can say the same thing about us. Like, there's no reason why we're going to be, the great guardians of the bomb. Like, we've had all sorts of near misses, we've lost the bomb, so on and so forth. And, just to use your own source, you cited the Sagan example, right? Like, Sagan has some Orientalist language in his text where he's like, I trust North Korea with the bomb because they're a traditional Asian kingdom. And you're just like, what is all this? Why do we have to go to the psych approach? There are other levels of this, that I don't know. For me, might seem more prudent or useful in terms of thinking about the real concrete differences in terms of grand strategy or just even grand strategy in general. Hey.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly what I mean. Waltz has a sort of section that sort of does that. Every time there's proliferation, those who have the weapons, and the only ones we have really good records are of the Americans, basically say, oh, well, if those people, so at first it was the Russians, my God, those barbarians, when they get the weapon, they're going to just be crazy. And each subsequent step of the proliferation discourse. So that's all arguing that in favor of this idea that you are definitely more sanguine about the net effects of proliferation if you assume that people are generally can be relied upon, or states can be relied upon to act rationally in the classical definition of the term. So I totally accept. So that's a really good argument on the other side. Like every time people claim that they're not going to act right. So when is it actually going to happen? I hope we never find out. When is it actually going to be right when they assume that, oh, well, that state is going to be different than all the other states that got nuclear weapons? So that's, again, I think arguing that's consistent with what we're saying in the paper. But overall, yeah, I think that's it's a complete, you have to come up with ancillary arguments about why do you think that the United States can run this grand strategy in a way that is not making things worse for the United States and the world. If states routinely depart from a strict rational choice assumption, if that's the assumption of the grand strategy, then why should any state have this much power? Shouldn't they be constrained more? And my answer to that is really unsatisfactory, but it's basically, I don't have a great answer to it. I think it's a wonderful critique, but there's sort of two answers. One is, there's one answer. Let me just try to, it's empirical in nature. And we talked about it at lunch, so it's unfair, but I'll raise it again, which is that this argument that somehow, and Caleb, my co-author, makes this argument, so we're always debating this thing. It's like this argument that somehow that states, that leaders of states become less rational, less careful, more inclined to do threat inflation, more inclined to do crazy stuff when they are unconstrained than when they are constrained. So if you believe that argument, you definitely should not like deep engagement. And I know there's a lot of research behind that argument, but just empirically, I'm completely unpersuaded. Because most of the craziest, wackiest stuff that states have ever done, they've done when they were massively constrained. So every single great power war, every single wild theory of hegemonic conquest, we got a security problem. What should we do? Let's take over the entire world. That World War I, World War II, Napoleonic Wars, that all happened in systems of very closely matched, multipolar systems with states closely matched. We had bipolarity with the Soviet Union breathing down our necks. It was a bipolar system. And what did we have? We had Vietnam, we had massive commitment to a huge war in 9,000 miles away that dwarfs in cost in relative and absolute terms every single war we fought in the unipolar era. So I just know empirically, constraining states in a multipolar, making yourself weaker and more equal to the other states does not just empirically generate always prudent behavior and careful consideration of threats. I see more threat inflation and more crazy sort of behavior that seems to be courting disaster in evenly balanced systems than I saw the U.S. do in the unipolar system. So I know that's not really a particularly good answer. It's empirical, as against we have sort of theory to believe the other side. So that's one reason, however, for at least putting a question mark over that particular critique. But it's a good one. It's totally a good one. And by the way, I am not a massive partisan, but I will say that I would say that there are certainly people in the world today who are probably wondering about how much sense it makes to run their affairs with America as the hegemon. They're sort of thinking like, yeah, I wonder if that was a really good idea. So I totally get that argument.
So I hope my question is this. Yeah, I hope my question isn't too redundant. But so you've surveyed the literature on deep engagers and written a lot of it yourself, and you framed it as kind of an optimism versus pessimism kind of debate. And I'm curious why it might be that pessimists on deterrence, on nuclear proliferation, on balancing, why pessimists think that these problems wouldn't still occur with the United States being engaged.
So say that. Why do they think balancing and cooperation and all these things work better with a hegemon?
So,
with a state that has security guarantees and using its leverage to achieve those outcomes?
well, so take
Basically what we say is like balancing is more likely, cooperation is more likely, economic globalization is more likely, because there's a really, really powerful state that is trying to make those things happen.
Okay, fair.
That sort of thing. But I wanted to go back to the thing about deep engagement, because Eugene is right. Euge is right that Brooks and I wrote this book, and he's gracefully recognizing that the grand strategy we spelled out in that book is actually an ideal grand strategy. So it's not one that the United States has actually followed. Its core elements are ones the United States has followed. But it is just like the restraint camp has this grand strategy they wish the United States would follow. We have one too. And yeah, I guess you're right that it's kind of like, aside from us, who is there? How are the differences that some of those pieces of deep engagement, some of the components of it, are indeed features that have characterized American grand strategy since 1950. Some of them are really long-standing actual practices. And so there's a whole lot of scholarship and advocacy and debates around each of those planks. It's just they don't cohere to the full grand strategy in the way that we define it. And I will say that just the last thing I'll say on this is that when Brooks and I wrote that book about deep engagement, we were just completely in the world of restraint. In other words, the way we thought about grand strategy, what are American interests, how should we think about everything, all the inputs to how we frame that book came from work from people like Huge. So anyway, that's why the debate has a certain coherence to it, even if we continue to disagree.
Thank you, Professor. Much of the discussion today in the read-ahead focused on state actors, which is understandable given this is an IR paper, but we do live in a world where both state and non-state actors pose threats to the U.S. We had much of our foreign intervention has been targeted at terrorists in the Middle East. The Trump administration seems to be discussing drug cartels in Mexico a lot. So given that these threats exist, I'm curious whether you would, by your definition, argue that restrainers believe people to be rational, or whether states are rational? And if so, what makes states kind of this unique institution? I guess it's most prescient with the nuclear proliferation example, but for instance, would the DPRK be a more responsible arbiter of the bomb than, say, ISIS, or is there kind of no distinction?
Yeah, I think in the paper we elide the distinction. We focus on leader rationality rather than state rationality. But actually, some of the arguments in play are about how leaders work within the context of a government and bureaucratic politics, organizational constraints, the trade-offs between domestic and international, and so a more holistic view of these middle-range theories, I think, would consider both state and leader rationality. So both, and we would probably do more thinking about emotions and motivation. I think it could be. I'm getting slightly off, but it could be that Brooks and I and Caleb think that another distinction can be like how you think about state interests and how likely it is that leaders will pursue other objectives than security and economic capacity. They might pursue status, they might pursue prestige. I think we're more willing to consider that those motives matter in international politics, and how they push between restraint and deep engagement is the same exact debate we just had with Kevin about rationality. Because if you think states maybe pursue status or maybe pursue glory, then why wouldn't the United States pursue the same thing? But anyway, that's one. But that's one. But on the specific, that's one. you've hit upon a point that we're discussing, like how to frame this and think about it in terms of leader of state rationality. But yeah, on that question, yeah, I personally think that a lot of the scholars who write on this do think that states, even the DPRK, are different units of analysis than a non-state organization, and that a lot of the arguments that you see in that old classic Walt-Sagan debate, it's really about what happens to your thinking about various things when you have a thing called a state that can be destroyed. And it's the whole logic of some of the theories of why proliferation could solve security problems just presume the idea that you have territory and that you care about it and you value things within the territory, and all of that may not apply to non-state actors.
Okay, turning to the boiler room on which the online community is living.
Yes, so we have a question from Kaylee on chat. You mentioned at one point in your presentation, and I'm hoping you can expand on it a bit more, to what extent does the nature of a U.S. pullback matter to these theories? So if the U.S. withdraws and sets everything else on fire on the way out, or if they are able to achieve a quiet withdrawal, how does the U.S. step back matter in this question?
Yeah, I mean, on that one, we've always, I've tried in my writing never to caricature the restraint position as one of being just like tomorrow, just wake up and chaotically go home. If you read Barry Posen's book, he has a strategy. Here's how we can move towards this world where the United States would be disengaged, rather than just put it out on social media and then tell them to come home the next day. So I think we all think that matters, and we all think everybody in the debate knows that a carefully implemented strategy is probably better than a non-carefully implemented strategy. And frankly, to look under the hood on this, I can tell you that my co-author and I think all of us, all three of us, but all the co-authors I've worked with in grand strategy, including Ben Valentino and Steve Brooks, now Caleb, we all think that if we had to pick another grand strategy, it would totally be restraint. Restraint is a very appealing, it's a very appealing strategy. It wouldn't be this thing called offshore balancing, which is very popular. If you're going to do it, do it. If you're going to get pull back, pull back. So in a way, like what might be happening is kind of the worst of all worlds for us. And it could be because it's happening in a way that is not, doesn't look to me to be a carefully calibrated strategy, but rather a set of impulses based on some bets about the world that the new administration has.
Me too, Mike.
Iron law of the faculty meeting. All that's been said has been said, but not everybody has said it. I agree with Eugene. It is not clear to me that the stakes of the rationality debate that you lay out map onto deep engagement or restraint the way you hypothesize. Maybe the nuclear argument, the Sagan-Waltz, but a lot of these other arguments, not at all clear to me. And I was sort of surprised about the lack of a clear connection between that, beyond one interpretation of the Sagan-Waltz debate. But I want to go to a different issue. So 15 years ago, we had this argument over a IR theory comp answer about whether Kenneth Waltz in Theory of International Politics had a theory of rationality. And a certain colleague of mine, whose name you've invoked, but I don't think he's here. I hope he's not here, because I'm going to admit that I think he was right on this, made an argument that I found at the time hard to accept, that Waltz, at least the Waltz of Theory of International Politics, did not have a theory of rationality, or a theory that depended on unit rationality. And when you think about it, there's a lot in Waltz and structural theory that emphasizes the unintended consequences of behavior. So, for example, the positive side, you get a balance of power when two actors are committed to each achieving primacy. Whereas, the security dilemma could be a structural argument about, why you're doing something to enhance your own security that, creates a spiral. So when you start thinking about a world in which you have even a lower level of rationality, a world in which a lot of the interesting things are the result of unintended consequence of state behavior, again, it seems maybe not every time, but in a lot of instances, where recognizing that would lead you to be less engaged rather than more engaged. Really deep engagement depends on a high level of rationality in certain instances, and especially, as you said up front, for the hegemon to behave rationally. But again, if we lower that, which I think there are reasons not only in the literature that you cite, but even in a certain interpretation of structural realism, the assumptions of rationality just aren't critical to restraint at all. In fact, the lack of rationality is a reason to be very careful if you do anything.
Well, it could be. I mean, it's definitely food for thought. This is a new endeavor, and I will we will be thinking hard about what you and Eugene have said. I think that, though, that on the question of balancing, the theory, at least the theory that we use, the middle range theory that we use in our book is basically Mearsheimer's. I mean, it's basically that, regional balancing tends to not work. I think he thinks it's rational, so it might not even be, so I might be talking myself out of the argument right now, but the key point is that he does have a very carefully developed argument for why an overseas security provider actually has a pretty easy task of solving the collective action problem for local balancers. Like, he thinks that, by his own theory, it's geographically distant, it itself doesn't have as much threat, it's got all this sort of stuff, so it can come in and provide security guarantees and help the local actors coordinate a balance without getting into the kind of problems that happen when you are a contiguous great power living next to each other. So there's a kind of theory there, while actually the cognitive demands for the United States to step into these regions, provide security in a way that overcomes balancing problems that he sees as endemic, actually works and actually is not that hard. And actually why it's much harder and much higher bar for the local actors themselves to do the same thing, because they have much more difficult time creating postures that are not simultaneously threatening and create all these other problems. So that's sort of where that balancing piece of it comes from.
I wonder, John's argument's very influential, and certainly it's important that it be given, due acknowledgement in these grand strategy debates, but it's sort of my impression that there's a lot more Mearsheimer in your vision of the world than there is in a lot of the restrainers' visions of the world. So the offense-defense balance that Marco mentioned, John has no use for that.
Yeah, no, that's right.
You could go through a lot of different things where the tragedy of great power politics view as compelling and as innovative as it is also frankly idiosyncratic, and that the restraint arguments draw on a larger body of theorizing. And the most important one, I think, is Walt's and structural realism, which John has abandoned in important respects.
Yeah, I think that gets to the key point, though. We're focusing, and really helpfully, on the second part of the article, on the psychological, as opposed to the first part of the article, which is on the middle range theories. And what you just said, just is a huge exclamation point over the importance of unpacking the middle range theories. It's just to say that this is grounded in realism and this is grounded in liberalism is just ridiculous. So that really hammers that home, that we found the way Mearsheimer models these regional security dynamics to be pretty compelling. and you don't. And so that's fine. So that's what we're doing in the first part of the article. Where I need to do more work, I need to think more, is like, okay, so how does rationality fit into this? How does rationality fit into the argument about balancing failures? And the way I was thinking about it when we drafted this article was the what theory is identified, and not just Mearsheimer's, but security dilemma theory, and like there's a huge amount of IR. So I want to just reduce it to John Mearsheimer. A huge amount of IR that people read in intro IR class and graduate classes reduces to the idea that to balance, to create security in a region, especially contiguously positioned major powers, is really not that easy to do. And whereas the restraint view is it's totally easy to do. And so we think it has a high cognitive demand. It places high demands, high decision-making demands on leaders to secure themselves in a way that doesn't create problems. After all, the history of the international relations is those problems. What do you study in history? You study the problems states have in securing themselves. They want to secure themselves, and we end up with 400 years of nonstop bloodshed, practically. And so we know from IR theory that this stuff is really, really hard to do, especially in a region of contiguously placed great powers. That's what you study in international history. That's what you study in international relations theories. It therefore places really high cognitive demands to say, oh, now you'll be able to do it, no problem. Of course, that 400 years did not have nuclear weapons. So if you're going to hinge the argument on nuclear deterrence and say nuclear deterrence doesn't require particularly heroic assumptions of rationality, that might be where you go. But to argue that somehow balancing is as smooth as silk doesn't require like pretty high demands on states to do it in a way that doesn't result in disaster is kind of running against a ton of theory and evidence.
All right, next up is Father Bill.
Thanks very much for your presentation. I'm a historian of 20th century American foreign relations. And my question is one of sort of relates ends and means. The United States does not have unlimited means. It has to determine what it can accomplish, sort of the old John Gaddis strategies of containment, etc. So are we in a period where deep engagement is recalibrating? So the United States obviously expects Europe to do a lot more than it has done. Administrations, going back to Kissinger, have been asking the Europeans to do more. They never get off their rear ends. I think they are going to, it seems, under this administration. And the United States has to recalibrate and put an enormous more effort into the Indo-Pacific. Now, this is not restrainer. That's not restrainer, but it's a different kind of deep engagement. So in creating these theoretical models, deep engagement, restraint, where is the sort of room for recalibration, rethinking how deep engagement is to be applied? It can't be the same extended US involvement everywhere. The US can't sustain it. The Middle East has to be reduced in terms of its call on the United States, and clearly Europe has to play a larger role. But that doesn't mean the United States is going to pull back to Fortress America.
No, that's a great question, and it really reminds me that I should have clarified that issue. So when we started this debate, again, I look over these gentlemen have been debating these things for much too long. Many of you may not even have been on board when these arguments first surfaced. We agreed that the United States had the ability to pursue disengagement. We disagreed whether it should pursue disengagement. Now the debate is changing, and there are many who believe the United States no longer has the capacity to pursue deep engagement simultaneously in Europe and Asia. So this is the view of the people in this administration who actually do think a lot about these matters carefully. People who've been appointed to various national security positions in this administration, that's their argument, that we cannot do it. We just can't. And that's a different argument than what I was talking about today. I left out the can we do it completely and just forecast what will it be like. I don't know that we're actually headed towards yes, I mean, there's a theory among some Trump officials that is completely serious, that says that anything short of a massive shock and the Europeans will never do what, in their mind, the Europeans must do. So you could actually view some of these recent events. They may seem chaotic. I think they actually are chaotic. However, there are people in the administration who can look at that and say, this is exactly what we needed to do. So that I left out of the talk today about capacity. We could have that debate. I do think there are many people in Washington who exaggerate the threat of China. I think they have an exaggerated view both of its power and the amount of power it takes to contain it. But that's a separate debate than what I was talking about. So you're absolutely right.
All right, so this, and I apologize if I utterly butchered this name, is from Mihailo. So can we include the distinction between restraint and engagement, the different views on preventing hegemonic decline?
And yes, there is definitely a big distinction on that front. And so Barry Posen and many other distinguished advocates of restraint, and then many who advocate this in-between strategy of offshore balancing, which is about pulling out of Europe and supposedly the Middle East. I'll believe it when I see it. And then focusing on East Asia. They definitely are more pessimistic about America's power position and have a much more robust view of China as a pole in the international system. And clearly in that camp are two very distinguished scholars of international security, John Mearsheimer and Steve Wald, who really see China as posing a threat to a core American interest via what it could conceivably do to dominate its region. Whereas true restrainers are highly skeptical that China can translate its capabilities into some sort of domination of Asia that would come back to have impact on core American interests. So that's a very, very big distinction that is often elided in discussions of grand strategy.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. Do you think at the end of the day, you've got lots of footnotes and everything, but at the end of the day, do assessments about rationality, are they real assessments, or are they sort of intuition, or maybe even projection, right? People have their ways of looking at the world, and it's projection instead of assessment. That's one point. Another one, have you thought of other psychological frameworks you could have used? So I'm thinking maybe Myers-Briggs or introvert, extrovert, or sense of security, insecurity could lead to some of the same assessments that you came up with for rationality?
Yes. So on the second question, yes, there are many other potential insights, and one of them is the power versus security. There's a great deal of political psychology. There's a great deal of psychology research on these different ways of thinking, these different mindsets between overarching emphasis on security versus an emphasis on power and control. And in some ways, you can see that mapping into these grand strategies with the restraint side of this debate, very, very worried about security, very focused on security, and seeing power more as a problem than as a solution. And the deep engagement side, seeing power as a solution to things. It's the need for power and the need for control to deal with your world, as opposed to the world is just a problem, it's a threat. If you can not have to deal with it, you shouldn't have to deal with it. So that there is work that maps onto that. I personally have always viewed, and I know restrainers love this, I always view it as a conservative liberal, conservative radical. I view restraint as radical. And deep engagement is conservative. I mean, the idea that you're going to these tried and true institutions, these practices that have brought us so far, it's this basic idea that the world sucks, but it could be a lot worse. In fact, it almost certainly will be a lot worse. There before the grace of God. The Hobbesian argument, basically this arrangement we have, it's horrible. Who would want this except the alternative, which is even worse? So that's the conservative mindset in my view, and they are these pie in the sky, and it's like hippie days, man. We're gonna remake the entire world. It's gonna be great. It's all gonna work out great. So I do see that. I see that as a conservative liberal thing, a radical. Sort of the idea that restraint is conservative is just weird to me. But anyway, that's not a political psychology and stuff. But I think there are other insights from the psychology literature that would help. And so this paper is a first cut at saying, maybe some of the differences on grand strategy can be illuminated by asking what sort of assumptions they make about how people see the world and how people perceive the world. Yeah. Now, what was the?
I might be confusing between assumptions people are making about the world and where they're coming from as people.
That's right.
And
yeah.
So I'm a little unclear on that because that's my own fault.
Yeah. For our paper, we were really asking about what assumptions they make about how leaders and how states make decisions, rather than where they're coming from. So that was my fault. I pushed us into like, are you a liberal or are you conservative? So that was just rhetoric on my part. So the true answer to your question is that yes, that's how we're thinking of it, and that there are other. So we're in discussion about other potential fruitful ways to look at this debate through these lenses.
All right, now it's Lynn. Okay, so. Hello, thanks for the talk. I'm ready to harass you about a bunch of things during your visit, but I'm going to harass you about two more things. The first comment really builds on Dan Lindley's question just now, and that has to do with what really drives these differences between the restrainers and the deep engagers when it comes to beliefs about rationality. So it could be that you have a bunch of theories of the world unrelated to international relations, unrelated to international security, that altogether shape you into someone that believes that, look, things, if left alone, will tend to work out versus, no, you do need to control things for them to work out, right? So things like your theories about whether big government versus limited government in domestic politics is optimal or not. So in this case, you have different theoretical priors, live experience, nurture, that create these differences in your assumptions about rationality. Or it could be the type of disposition or dispositional arguments that Dan was trying to point at, which is that maybe the Eugene Golds of the world are just very optimistic and they're warm and fuzzy people. And he's laughing, right? No, it's true. And he just has a lower level or a lower need for control / closure. And so he tends to think that things will be fine if you just leave it alone, versus maybe Caleb does not think that way. He needs control. He needs closure, and so he's less optimistic, and that's why he believes that you do need to be involved, you do need to be deeply engaged for things to work out. So again, is it this, theories of the world that's unrelated to security or position?
So my answer is going to be the absolute naive answer, the total naive. Like I truly believe that that has nothing to do with it. And that if we did a psychological test of various kinds, we want to see what is the correlation between these basic dispositions. And again, we can all argue about these tests you take and how good are they at really capturing these dispositions. But let's set that aside. You take the standard psych research where they ask you to do a battery of things and they classify, oh, you are a blank, you're empathetic. And I firmly believe that would have no correlation to your position in this debate. And that this debate comes through, look, Mearsheimer and Mearsheimer and Rosado. Okay, this is a world of uncertainty, and your differences are coming from honest, reasonable differences over possible futures of the world that are informed by the various theories that you find most persuasive. And I'm not 100% sure that these guys find their theories more persuasive because of some deep disposition, and that I find slightly different middle-range theories more persuasive is coming from deep psychological differences. I will tell you this, and in a personal story of how did we get to this, how did Brooks and I get to this deep engagement thing? Reluctantly, slowly, and like after we did everything we could to not do it. I mean, basically, we wrote a whole book about America's position in the world. We didn't want to say anything about what strategy is to pursue. We wrote a foreign affairs article saying America's awesome. It's basically, it was like American primacy and perspective, that article written 25 years ago. And at the end, we said, well, we should be nice. And then I'd go give a talk and say, America's amazing, and no one's ever going to, it's going to be a unipolar and all this stuff. And that's it. But we should be nice. And people say, like, why? Why should we be nice? And I taught a grand strategy class, and I told my students The only way to think about grand strategy is actually to put yourself in the position of a person who has to make it. Just imagine you're running a state. It's the conceit of the Ivy League. You're going to be, but it's basically like the only way to think of it. And so they said, well, Professor, what do you think? And Brooks and I had assiduously refrained from taking a position in the grand strategy debate because we had some feeling like we should separate the analysis of America's power position from the prescription about what should we do. So we only got to that. Then we got mad because like all writing on grand strategy seemed to be by these guys. So we wrote this article like, I don't know about coming home, America. So we wrote the article with Eichenberry. And only ourselves really got into trying to make the case in 2016. So that was like 25 years after starting to write about America's power position. So I honestly think that's what I think I came to that assessment of the costs and benefits through scholarship and thinking rather than through some deep basic position. And so I project that on all of my colleagues, and I think similarly for them, they reach their positions on this grand strategy debate because of their scholarship, their work, their reading of history, their understanding of how international politics works, and maybe some view like how should we think about American interests. Like I didn't talk about that today because for most of this we sort of agree that how we think about American interests are similar. But there could be some subtle differences to how we think about American interests that help to explain. But I'm not sure, so I'm pushing back.
Well, I was not suggesting that you would think that psychological differences is driving this difference between you and your students. But that maybe if you believe that sometimes individuals work on heuristics, and you clearly do, given the second part of your paper, then maybe that is a possibility.
Yeah, they sometimes work on heuristics, but not me when I'm writing. No, I'm just kidding. But the truth is that all the research we cite, and that's why I say it. Like restraint has a really easy answer to this. It's just like, well, normally people aren't rational, but they're definitely rational on this stuff because this is like life and death stuff for states. And so similarly, I think scholars can never completely work to try to overcome biases, and they can try to be better at it than people who are getting paid to think certain ways. They can try to be truly independent, and we definitely try to do that. So I think, so you're right. You can't fully avoid biases in here of various kinds. But you can do your best. And I think, with all of its faults, everybody loves to criticize the Ivy Tower and all the academic profession at least gives you a greater opportunity and some incentive to do that than some other professions.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. One thing that stood out from the read ahead was the section about the nuclear revolution, kind of towards the end of the paper, where you talk about how restrainers implicitly suggest that leaders are rational, and if restrainers are nuclear optimists essentially because they don't believe leaders will be rational and therefore not use nuclear weapons even if they proliferate. And then you talk about how deep engagers go off the assumption that nuclear armed leaders are less rational in practice. I guess my question is, do you think that you can make an argument for deep engagement while still maintaining optimism on leader rationality? I feel like, I don't know, an argument that comes to mind would be like the U.S. benefits from being in security agreements that stops nuclear proliferation to Japan or South Korea or other countries in Europe, without arguing that if nuclear weapons were to proliferate, that those leaders wouldn't be rational with them. So I guess could you, I don't know, maybe explain that part a little bit more? Because what came in my mind, I was thinking, when I think of the nuclear revolution on one end, I think of the stability instability paradox on the other end, which essentially is just maybe nuclear proliferation is not necessarily, I guess nuclear weapons don't dissuade a state from attacking maybe as much as some other theorists would suggest. So I guess I'm not overly convinced by the idea that deep engagers have to be skeptical of rationality of nuclear armed states. So I guess, I don't know, could you go into a little bit more detail on that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I was thinking about the nuclear aspect of the argument, and of course you don't need to have nuclear weapons to be able to deter aggressors, right? You just have to be powerful enough that an invasion or an attack would be too costly for them. And I'm not saying that this is possible, but suppose that the thing that I'm proposing is indeed possible. So suppose the U.S. could treat everyone like Ukraine. They could make it very clear that they are never sending troops anywhere, but they're gonna fund everyone who is attacked by their adversaries. I'm sorry. In that case, I assume that China would not invade Japan, or Russia would not invade Germany or whatever, and China would not invade Korea. And so assuming that these states accepted this arrangement and everyone knew that this was the new setup, would you be inclined to support such an arrangement?
Yeah, you could still be, well, I'll do both super quick. I think we do have, there's a lot of theory and evidence, once again, that people get worried about windows. They start saying, well, if I'm going to, this is one of the problems with offshore balancing as a grand strategy. If you say, like, if you are attacked, I will aid you, that simply incentivizes people to make sure that it's quick and decisive and that you move before the target gets bolstered. And so it's a very inefficient way to induce security. And also it assumes that you've got, like, Ukraine on the receiving end, which I think in some of the countries you mentioned you do, but not all countries that are under threat are going to be able to absorb external aid and use it as effectively as Ukrainians have. So I'm skeptical of that, but mainly because it might incentivize windows of opportunity. It might incentivize people to do preemptive or war. On the rationality thing, it's just this. The U.S. has worked for 70 years to give security to states. We have to prevent them from proliferating. We have ample record that there would be a lot more nuclear weapons in the world if the United States hadn't made these efforts. Restrainers are critical of many of these efforts. Now, I don't know if they think most of them weren't necessary. And what I'm trying to say is that counterfactual world where we have a lot more nuclear powers, your overall confidence in the stability of that world hinges to some degree on your confidence that states will continue, as they have thus far, to avoid departures from strictly rational behavior. And the more, it's a game of numbers. Eugene is right that U.S. grand strategy does place high demands on the United States as well as it does on other nuclear powers, but especially on the United States because of extended deterrence. But this is a numbers game. When you go from 8 to 12 to 20 to 25 to 40, if you are just a little bit nervous about how much you could rely on those states to act as you hope they would act, you will be willing to pay some, if you're a little bit nervous, given the downside cost, you will be willing to pay some costs up front to avoid that.